Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining our National House Campaign call. We're going to give it a second for folks to join on the line, and then we're going to get started. We have a really great agenda today talking about the National Tenants Bill of Rights, and we will get started in just a second. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining today's National House Campaign call. I'm Sarah Sadian. I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy and Field Organizing with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. It's good to be with all of you today. As a reminder, we started our House campaign so that we could focus on advancing the anti-racist policies and achieving the large-scale sustained investments that are needed to ensure that renters with the lowest incomes have an affordable place to call home. And we launched this campaign because we recognized that more than ever, we needed bold policies to ensure that the most marginalized households, the lowest income households, need to have a stable, affordable home. So on our call today, we're going to have advocates from across the country. They include homeless service and shelter providers, housing advocates, resident organizers, people with lived experience, including low-income individuals receiving or in need of federal housing assistance, people experiencing homelessness, philanthropy, and more. And we thank you so much for joining with us today. Like I mentioned, we have a really exciting topic of conversation for today's call. We're going to be discussing a major new policy agenda, the National Tenants Bill of Rights, which was created by the National Housing Law Project, the Tenant Union Federation, and the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. I'm going to share with everybody a link to the National Bill of Rights for you to check out when you can. I'm going to put that into the chat box now. And we're going to go into a lot more detail. We're going to talk about, we're going to hear from Seamus Roller with the National Housing Law Project about the Tenant Bill of Rights and the agenda, how it shifts power to renters, how it addresses long-term racial and social inequities, how it advances housing justice. We'll also hear from the Law Project's Marie Claire and Kayla on our team, who's going to go into much more detail about the rights that are within the Tenant Bill of Rights. We're going to hear from Dee Ross on our team about how this responds to the urgent needs that we're hearing about from renters themselves, about why tenant protections are so needed. And Noelle Porter from the Law Project will discuss ways that all of us can take action to build the political will for the National Tenant Bill of Rights and build political power. But before we go into that, before we jump into the agenda, I just want to remind everybody that you can ask questions in the Q&A box. And you can introduce yourself in the chat box and where you're from. It's really a lot easier for us to follow the questions that you ask if you put them in the Q&A box. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. And at the end of today's call, we'll share a copy of the presentation and a copy of the recording and all of our other materials with everybody in the days to come. So you'll be able to get everything that you need. So with that, I'm just going to quickly give you a little bit more background on the National Tenant Bill of Rights and why the National Low-Income Housing Coalition felt it was so important for us to create this agenda with our partners. So you may know that, as this call indicates, this is the National House Campaign that we put together. And one of the major pillars in our National House Campaign has always been around strengthening and enforcing renter protections, because we see it as being central to any comprehensive strategy to end homelessness and housing poverty and to advance racial and social equity. So just as a quick reminder, when we talk about the National House Campaign, we're talking about 4 major solutions: bridging the gap between incomes and housing costs, usually through something like emergency universal rental assistance for everyone who needs it. We talk about preserving and building new homes affordable to people with the lowest incomes by preserving public housing and building new homes through the National Housing Trust Fund. We focus on preventing evictions and homelessness by providing full ongoing permanent funding for emergency rental assistance and other eviction diversion programs. And fourth, we talked about strengthening and enforcing renter protections to address the power imbalance that exists between landlords and renters. And you're welcome to check out the House campaign. I'll put a link to that as well in the chat box. Just a second. There we go. So we included renter protection in our House campaign because we were hearing a lot from renters themselves, and because we knew through our advocacy work that the lack of renter protections was really contributing to housing insecurity and homelessness. It's contributing to racial and social inequities faced by people of color, including Black and Indigenous people, people with disabilities, immigrant households, and many others. And before we launched the House campaign, we felt like there was less of an appetite for, or political appetite to establish and implement renter protections at the national level. But since that time, there's been a real movement and a recognition that renter protections are critically important. I think this came about when the pandemic hit and advocates and policymakers were able to see very clearly a few things. One, that renter protections, along with all of the other resources that Congress passed, made a real difference between whether or not people were stably housed or whether they lost their housing. And in turn, whether people were able to stay safe and healthy or if they were to suffer health risks. Two, we saw that even when there was a really clear connection between staying housed and somebody's health, we know that there was this huge evidence base that was built up that showed that staying housed saved lives, literally. But we still saw landlords evict people from their homes, often unlawfully and in violation of the CDC's eviction moratorium. And we saw other predatory behaviors from landlords, like dramatically raising rents, discriminating against renters of color and renters with disabilities, and harassment by landlords. And all of that was shown that even in the most dire circumstances, we still saw this power imbalance play out between landlords and renters that put renters at risk. And lastly, we saw that it was just becoming more and more clear that unless there was federal protections in place to apply to all renters to serve as a floor of basic rights that we all need, we were going to see more renters being pushed out of their home and face the consequences of that. So we joined with the National Housing Law Project and with the Tenant Union Federation to put together this policy agenda. It follows tenants throughout the course of their experience in housing, from applying to housing, signing the lease, living in their home. And it was written with direct input from renters and people with lived experience, advocates, legal aid experts, and many others. And for NLHC, we really turned to our tenant leaders and participants in our tenant collective, our tenant talk live meetings, and our race and state and local tenant protection working groups for feedback. More importantly, we see this as building on all of the success that many of you have had around the country. We know that all of you have played a really critical role in enacting or implementing the more than 300 renter protections that have been put in place at the state and local level in recent years. And it builds on the partnership or the leadership of tenant leaders who've been doing this work for a very long time, like the National Alliance of HUD Tenants, which is the only tenant-led housing organization at the national level. So I'm really excited for you to hear more about what's in the Tenant Bill of Rights and how you can take action to build the political support, how we can build tenant power so that we can put this into law. And we're going to learn a little bit more about how we can, the hard work that's ahead to make sure that we can really see these transformative reforms be put into place. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Seamus Roller, who's Executive Director of the National Housing Law Project, for some opening remarks. Thanks, Seamus.
Thank you, Sarah. I just want to start by thanking Sarah and the rest of the team at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. I also want to thank the folks at the Tenant Union Federation. They're all out on vacation this week, which is why they couldn't join us on this presentation today, but really have enjoyed working with them on the Tenants Bill of Rights. I also really want to take a moment to thank Marie Claire Tran Leong, who you're going to hear from later. Marie Claire was really the lead on the drafting of this and on pulling in input from other organizations and really led that over a 2 year process with our three organizations. And the amount of work she put in this is really phenomenal. I want to thank her for that. Sarah talked about how so many of the ideas in this aren't ideas that we came up with. They didn't emerge from the great minds at our three organizations, but come from the work of tenant organizers and tenant leaders, and from activists and our friends who are elected officials all across the country. But also that the Tenant Bill of Rights ideas emerge from all across the world, from different tenant movements all across the world that are working on these set of issues to try to provide security of tenure for renters across the country. It's not just a United States issue, but it's one that binds us together with groups working across the world. So as we think about this, there are places around the country that where almost all of these rights are present, but there are also parts of our country where almost none of the rights are present. So there's a real patchwork of protections across the country. And part of this for us is about bringing up that floor of what tenants' rights should look like all across the country. In most places, an eviction is the fastest of the civil legal actions that can happen. It happens so rapidly in comparison to almost anything else. So in some places, you might get evicted in a mere 2 weeks from failure to pay your rent. There are very few due process and substantive protections for many tenants across the country, and that there's almost no ability to take action when a landlord is acting in a predatory or abusive manner in many places. And so what we want to do is bring up that floor of what rights look like across the country. Even a place like Colorado that we don't think of as one of those places that has limited tenants' rights, the Colorado legislature and the Supreme Court recently had to affirm that that sexual harassment by a landlord could be a defense in an eviction proceeding. Uh, in most states, a tenant can be evicted for no reason whatsoever with 30 days notice. And in a handful of states, you even if you file a discrimination complaint against your landlord and your landlord evicts you because of that complaint, that retaliation by your landlord isn't a defense to an eviction. You might be able to sue your landlord because they did it, but it's not a defense to the eviction. You're still going to get evicted because of that. And even where there are protections, one of the things that tenants tell us all the time is that there might be that sort of protection, but actually enforcing it, getting somebody to do something about it is a real challenge. And as Sarah mentioned, the tenants' rights and evictions are really tied to both race and to health. For those of you that read Matthew Desmond's Evicted, you know that Black women have faced the highest rates of eviction, that oftentimes there's a level of discrimination around race, around disability, around gender that plays in for people who get evicted and who suffer the upstream consequences before eviction, who get harassed by their landlords, who have other levels of housing instability. And we see this as a part of the strategy to remedy some of those historic discrimination that we see in the housing market overall. The other thing is part of this plays back to the time during the pandemic and when we saw so clearly that housing stability is tied to health and is tied to the health of families, that families that face instability suffer economically, but suffer from a health standpoint in a most uh, acute way. So the other thing I think about in this moment, and when we think about why this is the right moment for a National Tenants Bill of Rights, is that the housing market isn't the same as it was 15 years ago. The lack of tenants' rights that existed at one point was often moderated by a personal relationship between a landlord and a tenant. And so while there might not have been uh, clear legal protections, oftentimes that personal relationship meant that a landlord wasn't going to just behave absolutely terribly, or maybe that also meant you could go somewhere else. Now, because of the way the market functions, for many people, there's few options available. Housing is so expensive, it's hard to move. But it's also that your landlord might be a limited liability corporation. And behind that is some private equity company or some real estate investment trust or some other institutional investor. And many times those institutional investors have found a way to monetize the lack of tenant protections in the market. So they're trying to find ways to put on junk fees, to abuse the court system, to use it for their own means and to boost their own bottom line. And that there are just ways in which the housing market is being abused overall to extract extra money that's not a part of your rent or that is a part of your rent but is hidden from tenants all across the country. And so the need is even greater because of what a landlord looks like now and what that housing market looks like for so many tenants. So we view this as, as that baseline place in that, I think homeownership is a really important goal and for many families. But part of the reason that people strive for homeownership in this country is because being a renter can be so precarious. And that precarity that many renters face is a policy choice. And we need to start making different policy choices. We need to make sure that tenants have a certain level of rights and a certain level of protections overall. And this is part of that. And as we think about a comprehensive solution for the housing system that we have in the United States to have a more just housing system, I think about funding for affordable housing. I think about land use reform. I think about tax reform, and I think about housing rights. And this National Tenants Bill of Rights is an important part of ensuring that we have housing rights all across our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Seamus, for joining with us. We're going to dive right into it to give an overview of what are the rights that are included in the Tenant Bill of Rights. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Kayla Laywell at the National Low Income Housing Coalition and Marie-Claire Tran-Lung from the National Housing Law Project. Kayla?
Hey everybody, thanks Sarah. My name is Kayla Laywell. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a housing policy analyst here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. I am going to dive in. I see lots of questions in the chat already talking about the need to address fees, corporate ownership, lots of things. So first of all, the National Tenants Bill of Rights sets out 7 essential rights that establish a baseline of tenant protections in the rental housing market. These rights follow a tenant's experience from applying for housing to signing a lease to living in their home. The following 7 rights are an overview and won't encompass the full 52-page platform, but I'm going to put a link in the chat for folks to dive in and read the full National Tenants Bill of Rights. So together with Marie-Claire, we're going to get into it. So the first one, the National Tenants Bill of Rights, would establish a baseline of tenant protections, including number 1, the right to a fair application. So everyone should get a fair shot in the application process. Landlords should only consider information relevant to an applicant's obligation as a tenant. I'll pass it to Marie-Claire for more details.
Thanks, Kayla. So we're going to do a little bit of back and forth for the next few minutes. Before I do my part, I just want to, again, say thank you to the National Low Income Housing Coalition for organizing today's call and for bringing all of us together to talk about these issues. I think that there's great interaction in the chat right now, and to very much invite folks to engage, if there are things that you're seeing that would speak to you in this document, definitely let us know. And we're just happy to kind of continue to get feedback as this process continues and to hear from more folks. So just thank you everyone and the coalition for bringing us here today. So yes, we start with the right to fair application. And really what we're trying to make sure is that the application process is fair for everyone. And to do that, one of the things that we really need to do is to regulate, or that the government needs to do, is to regulate how landlords screen tenants. So applicants should not be denied housing because of information that is irrelevant to the question of whether they can carry out the responsibilities of being a tenant. For example, a voucher holder shouldn't have to show that their income is 3 times the amount of the total rent due when HUD is paying for a significant portion of that rent. Similarly, they shouldn't be denied based on low credit score or a lack of credit score. So we want to make sure that the information that landlords are considering is relevant to the process. We also need to make sure that the application process is more transparent and also much less of a black box, which is what we're hearing from a lot of applicants today on the housing market. And we need to remove unnecessary barriers like application fees that can deter people from even applying for housing in the first place. And in addition to landlords, we need to regulate the tenant screening companies whose practices often harm tenants without providing a corresponding benefit. So these companies often are third party in the landlord-tenant relationship and charge fees, often rely and distribute inaccurate or biased information, or make the application process less transparent. So we're trying to look at making sure that the tenants have rights so that the application process is more fair for everyone.
Thanks, Marie Claire. Okay, so that was the first right in the National Tenants Bill of Rights, the right to a fair application. The second is the right to a fair lease. So leases shape the landlord-tenant relationship, and they should clearly define the duties and rights of both parties to avoid predatory and deceptive terms.
So here, one of the things that we really focus on is the fact that the lease should be clear. It should be in plain language, accessible to everyone, and include the landlord's contact information. There should also be disclosures that are mandatory. So for example, the lease should talk about what does a tenant owe in rent, for which they may be evicted if they don't pay, versus non-rent fees, which may or may not factor into whether they can be evicted. There should also be clarity around how habitability issues are handled so that tenants can understand what their rights are with respect to other parts of this document. Also, the lease should be free from unreasonable terms. So, for example, some states give tenants important rights, like the right to a jury trial when you're being in an eviction proceeding. Some landlords, however, can go around these rights by making tenants waive them in the lease. And this undermines the policy that went into it at the state level and is generally an unreasonable practice and should not be allowed. Tenants should also not be subject to abusive terms. These type of terms often reset the rights to the disadvantage of the tenant. So one example is a lease term that might require tenants to pay attorney's fees to the landlord, but not the other way around where the tenant prevails.
Thank you.
Next slide, please. Yeah.
The third right is the right to freedom from discrimination and harassment. This one was really beefed up with support of our tenant leaders. No one should face discrimination, violations of privacy, or harassment in their homes by their landlords. Tenants should have the tools to prevent and stop such abuses.
So what we heard a lot from folks that we talked to was that to fight discrimination, we really need more funding, to invest more funding and more resources for government agencies that are tasked with enforcing the fair housing laws. Tenants also need to be able to defend themselves in eviction courts by asserting fair housing violations by their landlords. Otherwise, without those types of rights, a landlord could simply try to evict somebody for non-payment of rent to somebody who tried to assert their fair housing rights. In addition to discrimination based on protected classes, we need to protect tenants from harassment from their landlords, namely by giving tenants a private right of action, the ability to assert an affirmative defense in an eviction, and the right to attorney's fees when they are harassed. And we also need clear standards over when a landlord can access the unit to make sure that the tenant's privacy rights are protected.
The fourth right in the National Tenants Bill of Rights is the right to a habitable home. When tenants face a health or safety hazard or need a repair in their home, they should have a clear way to communicate that with their landlord, who should also make a prompt fix.
So what's really important here is that tenants should have a practical means of enforcing their right into a habitable home, something that they can help to enforce. They can have a role in enforcing and easily access others' help in doing so. So a few things that are here, we talk about a minimum standard that would apply across jurisdictions to a habitable home. We also think tenants should have the information that they need to assess whether, like, the condition of their home. So seemingly simple things like the maintenance history for their units, as well as neighborhood level risks that may be present for the property. And tenants should be able to enforce their rights, namely through a right to repair and deduct their rent, and sanctions for owners who fail to comply. And again, we say this a few times, but it's really important: the right to defend against an eviction where the landlord has breached the warranty of habitability. So that's at the tenant level. We also see the need to increase the transparency around landlords and properties. So here we're calling for state and local rental registries that have information about owners, property management companies, and building level information such as inspection and code enforcement history and eviction rates, and also a national database of federally subsidized housing that has similar information like eviction rates, health standards, and complaints, and also notes properties and owners subject to government enforcement actions.
Thank you. Next slide, please. The fifth right is the right to reasonable rent and costs. To protect tenants from financial shocks that put them at risk of eviction, safeguards are absolutely necessary to prevent rent gouging and excessive or hidden fees.
So we've seen the issue of rent and rent increases become hugely important to tenants over the last few years. And here it's very simple. We need regulation of rents to prevent unreasonable rent increases, such as many that we've been seeing in many of the jurisdictions that some of the folks on this call are sitting in. We also need to regulate non-rent fees and charges. One of the most important things is to ensure that tenants can't be evicted for failure to pay non-rent charges. This can happen where tenants may be behind on non-rent charges, and that stacks up. And then when they provide the rental payment, a landlord may apply that rental payment to the non-rent charges, and that keeps tenants vulnerable to an eviction filing. Other types of charges that need more standards and consistent regulation across the states are security deposits, late fees, utilities, and rental insurance.
Thank you. The sixth right in the National Tenants Bill of Rights is the right to organize. Tenants must have the ability to advocate for themselves without fear of retaliation or eviction from landlords, owners, and property managers.
So here we talk about strengthening the right to organize in federal housing programs, including the Housing Choice Voucher Program and the low-income housing tax credit program, which is the subject of proposed legislation in the Tenant Empowerment Act. In addition, I think long term, we want to talk about a federal right to organize in the private rental market. And that sort of right would need to talk about what are some of the protected activities that tenants could engage in. How do we make sure to protect tenants from retaliation for trying to organize their fellow tenants? remedies in case there's violations of this right, funding. And I think there was a question earlier or in the chat about the relationship between this and funding to make sure that people are able to have the resources they need to organize. And then a role for oversight of buildings by tenant associations. We've also included in this right establishing policies for tenant opportunity to purchase, which is commonly known as TOPA policies, to help empower tenants if they're in a situation where they might have access to resources and have an interest in retaining ownership or assuming ownership of the property that they live in.
Thank you. And finally, the last right in the National Tenants Bill of Rights is the right to safeguards against evictions. So due process is a basic right that we all have, including tenants. Tenants should also have protections from illegal evictions and evictions without good cause.
So here we talk kind of in three buckets. One is the right to security of tenure. So I think as Seamus mentioned earlier, in a lot of places people can be evicted quite easily. So there should be more protections to help people stay housed and to increase housing stability. One of those is just cause housing protection. So making sure to limit the reasons that a landlord can evict a household. There's also procedural protection, such as a notice of a lease termination, or excuse me, a lease violation, and then the tenant's right to cure that lease violation. So that just because there is a lease violation doesn't mean that you can automatically kick somebody out. You want to give people opportunity to maybe pay the back rent that they owe and find a way to retain tenancy. And then in specific situations, an ability to have early termination, which federal law does provide in very limited circumstances right now, such as, for example, when a service member is called to duty. In addition to the right to security of tenure, we talk about due process rights in eviction court. Eviction court is largely devoid of a lot of rights right now, and we want to make sure we want to strengthen that so that it is not, as I think Seamus has said before, like a conveyor belt of evictions and tenants going through. So trying to look into pre-filing eviction diversion, how can we make that available and accessible and have a balanced power between landlords and tenants during that process, and also looking at right to counsel and making sure that folks have a meaningful hearing if they do get in front of the eviction court. And then finally, a right to be free from unlawful self-help evictions. We've seen that be a problem in a lot of jurisdictions during the pandemic, after disasters, in a lot of different contexts that really make people, that really can destabilize a household, but also create a threat against other households and chill the ability of tenants to exercise their rights. And so, so we really want to strengthen these protections at the tail of it and a tenancy, so that we can preserve and create more housing stability, but also so that tenants don't have to live in fear of being evicted and suppress their ability to enforce their rights.
Thanks, Mary Claire. I'll turn it back to Sarah, but if anyone has any questions, again, this was just an overview, and I'll put my email in the chat for technical feedback.
Let's ask a couple of questions if we can from the audience before we move on, because there's so much great substantive work that Marie Claire and Kayla and others help put into this Tenant Bill of Rights. And I know that you're just giving a really high level overview. So I encourage folks to read the document yourself. There's a lot of great content there that we won't be able to get to all of it today, but there are some great questions in the Q&A box. One question is, which renters would this apply to? Would this be applied to all renters or just HUD renters? renters who are living in HUD backed housing. And can you tell us a little bit about enforcement? One of the things that we heard from a lot of our tenant leaders and others was this fear about putting more protections on the books, but not having a real way to enforce it. So maybe you can share a little bit more about how enforcement is envisioned under the Tenant Bill of Rights.
So I can start us off, and Kayla, you should definitely chime in if you would like to. I think in terms of the scope of what the type of tenants that this applies to, we try to have it cover both, but also very much recognize that it is that, I think we could write many, many, many more pages talking about, I think, the federally subsidized tenants. And right now, the disparities that you see between states, and especially where some states are far behind, is in the protections for tenants on the private rental market. And so much of this is focused there, but I think there are a lot of provisions that are also related to subsidized tenants across the different programs. And we try to, I think, call it out in there. So depending on what you're so for example, in the application discussion, we talk about principles that can apply to both contexts, both the private context and then the HUD subsidized context. And we also say there should be a standardized application process across the federally subsidized programs, because we heard that from tenants as a need. And then enforcement, I mean, we definitely recognize that enforcement is your laws are only, and your policies are only as good as they're enforced. And so that is something that we care very deeply about. And I think both of our organizations do, and have been working on various measures to try to make sure that policies are enforced. I think, for us, one of the biggest areas is around civil rights laws and fair housing, and making sure that those especially are enforced, because those already fall very squarely within the federal government's purview and do not get nearly as much funding and resources, and even staffing as is required. And I think that is not the only place where enforcement is needed, but that's, I think, where we focus in on for this, because we have seen sometimes enforcement be used against protected classes in a way that we really need to shore up those tools.
I would only add that the National Tenants Bill of Rights calls for robust funding from the federal government for enforcement across the country.
I appreciate that. I wish we could dig into it more. There's so many great questions in the Q&A box. So if you're able to stay on the call and answer some of those questions, love to encourage you to do that. But thank you so much for giving us an overview of what's included in the National Tenant Bill of Rights. Thanks, Marie Claire. Thanks, Kayla. Moving along, we're going to learn a little bit more from a tenant's perspective. What would it mean for the National Tenant Bill of Rights to be enacted? How does this reflect the experiences of a tenant themselves? So for that, we're going to turn to Dee Ross, who is a tenant leader fellow with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thanks, Dee, for joining.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. My name is Dee Ross. I am proud to be a tenant leader with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and I am the founder of the first tenant union in the state of Indiana, Indiana Tenant Association. I am a person with lived experience. I know what it's like to be unlawfully evicted, to become homeless and bounce in and out of shelters at a young age. And so I am a person with lived experiences sharing my truth. Today, I want to explain why the National Tenant Bill of Rights is so important for achieving fair and just housing. Many tenants from rural and urban communities across the country face significant challenges like unaffordable rent increases and unfair evictions. These problems not only affect individual families, but also prevent us from having fair housing for everyone. Without strong protections, tenants often have to deal with a difficult and unfair housing market. In my work as a tenant leader and an advocate, I have seen so many families be forced out of their homes, struggling to find safe and affordable places to live, and dealing with unfair treatment by landlords. During COVID, I witnessed a Black grandmother die from COVID after being unlawfully evicted, leaving behind 13 grandchildren. These are not just isolated incidents, but part of a larger problem that needs a comprehensive solution. The National Tenant Bill of Rights is a crucial step towards fixing these problems. It aims to create a standard set of protections for all tenants, ensuring everyone has access to safe, decent, and affordable housing. Some important parts of this bill that stand out to me is one, protection against unjust evictions. Tenants should not be evicted without a valid reason. And there should be legal help available for those facing eviction. Number two, fair rent practices. There should be measures to control unreasonable rent increases and ensure transparency in how rent is set. We, the tenants, should get to decide what's reasonable. Number three, safe and habitable living conditions. All rental properties should meet basic health and safety standards with regular inspections and real enforcement. Tenant voice and participation. Tenants should have a say in policies that affect their housing, and there should be resources to support their rights. A right to organize and not fear retaliation. It's important that people with lived experiences, lived expertise, like myself, are at the table when these decisions are made. If we're not at the table, then we are on the menu. Our firsthand experiences provide valuable insights and ensure that policies address the real issues tenants face. Strengthening tenant protections is about more than just housing. It's about racial equity, dignity, humanity, and fairness. The National Tenant Bill of Rights offers a chance to make the housing system more balanced and fair for tenants. By supporting and advocating for these protections, we can move a step closer to achieving housing justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dee. I so appreciate you sharing your perspective here and bringing us back to the reality of what tenants experience and how these protections are so needed. I'm wondering if you could just answer a question. Let's say let's just say we know we're going to be successful in enacting these renter protections. What would that change from your experience as a tenant? How would your life be different if you had these protections in place?
Yeah, I would be able to focus on thriving and not surviving. Oftentimes when you are in a systemic barrier situation and you're limited on your growth, you focus on surviving, you focus on a roof being over your head, you focus on food being on your table, you focus on the basic needs. We should have to focus on the basic needs being met. We should be able to focus on flourishing and thriving in a community and being successful in raising our children and building an everlasting legacy. And so, yes, if this is passed and enforced, this is a legacy. This is liberation. This is freedom. from a systemic issue that has plagued our communities for decades.
I love that. I love how you put that, Dee. And I think all of us on this call share that vision of where we want our country to go. And I, for one, at least, really see how this National Tenant Bill of Rights helps move us in that direction where, as you say, people aren't just surviving, but they're really thriving in their communities and in their homes and with their families. So thank you so much, Dee, for joining with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Now we're going to turn it over to Noelle Porter with the National Housing Law Project, who's going to share with us how can all of us take action to build the political will that's needed to enact a National Tenant Bill of Rights and to help us achieve what Dee put out as his vision for what our country could look like. So with that, I will turn it over to Noelle.
Thanks, Sarah. And dang it, it's really hard to follow Dee. Great to hear just our values at the very center of why we're having this conversation. So as we've said all along, this is an ambitious agenda that reflects the input of tenants across the U.S., housing experts, policy experts, lawmakers, organizations, tenant unions, etc. But we're not done. And what we have said to the world by putting this out and introducing this in conversations like this one is that we will not rest until tenants are protected in this comprehensive way. But what is it going to take to get there? As we've said all along, our goal is for this to become federal law. My puppy might make an appearance in the screen. Our goal is for this to become federal law and to ensure that there is equitable distribution of rights and protections for tenants across the country, regardless of where you live or who represents you in Congress. But there are going to be a number of different things we can do to get to that place where this has become recognizable law. So first, I just want to say we are really interested, especially this fall, in growing the list of endorsers. We would love to have every person on this call signed up to endorse the Tenants Bill of Rights as an individual, as an organization, if you have that responsibility for your organization, as a tenant union or tenant organizing crew. We would love to have you endorse this, and we would love to see endorsements from local electeds, federal and national electeds, and even folks who are running for office right now. I would love to see a candidate who is willing to say, I'm a housing candidate, I stand up for renters, and I've endorsed the National Tenants Bill of Rights. So first things first, Sarah and Kayla have both just dropped a link in the chat for how you can endorse this Bill of Rights. You can sign up through the link. You can also share the link with your friends, your partners, other organizations you work with, etc., so that we can grow that list. We want individuals, organizations, tenant groups, candidates, electeds, all listed as endorsers for this Tenants Bill of Rights. So share that link as far and wide as you can, send it on listservs, share it during meetings. Let's make sure we get this out to the masses. But also we're doing something really unique. We really believe that when the new Congress is set up, that'll be the 119th Congress of the US in January of 2025, that there's an opportunity to really run with this. And we're hopeful that this will be introduced as a full national package. We are expecting to see smaller bills pop up from the individual sections that Marie Claire and Kayla shared with you today. And so along the way, we want to do a number of things. First, it's building those endorsements, getting all of that excitement up. We're asking folks during this electoral process to be showing up at town halls, at candidate events, and asking folks, have you seen the National Tenants Bill of Rights and how do you feel about it? How do you feel about tenants' rights to organize? How do you feel about tenants' opportunities to purchase? The things that matter to you in this agenda should matter to the people you're voting to represent you. Do you have a favorite candidate that's running? Could you have a meeting with them as an individual or as a nonprofit that has those abilities? Could you talk to them about endorsing this Bill of Rights or even introducing local or state legislation to get moving? I know that NLIHC's state and local partners, as well as our network of local advocates, are interested in doing the work to advance some of these laws at the local and state level. And that's one of the things that's so exciting about this package. It can be chopped up into little pieces and used for your purposes at the local level, for advocating for your own state and local laws, for advocating for candidates or electeds to be more committed to tenants' rights and to the renters in their communities, or for advocating for federal laws to be passed. So we're asking for, as a reminder, a couple of different things. Spend this fall endorsing the package and getting your friends and partners to endorse the package as well. Again, those links are in the chat to endorse the National Tenants Bill of Rights, and you can share them far and wide. Get to electoral events throughout this fall. I would hope that candidates in your communities are hosting town halls, they're hosting local events, they're showing up at diners. Maybe you can invite them to show up to your housing complex, to get to know your neighbors, to engage with you on issues that matter to your community. And make sure in that time that they're familiar with the Tenants Bill of Rights and they've signed on to endorse it. You can also start engaging work at the local and state level to start to try to pass laws that you've seen discussed here today, policies that you've seen as priorities for us, for you, to get engaged with your local community lawmakers and really start to see change at the local and state level. And then as we move into the next Congress, look to these national organizations you're participating with, NLIHC, the Tenant Union Federation, and the National Housing Law Project, for opportunities to ask your members of Congress to sign on to legislation, get engaged in a fight to pass bills and laws, and to see this thing all the way through to a federal protection for tenants of all kinds. So with that, I'll turn it back to Sarah, and I'm sure we've got time for a few questions and updates on the way out the door.
Yeah, I'm just like looking through a lot of the comments, looking through some of the questions, and I think, Noelle, come back. I think one of the things that comes up is, how does this add to the conversations that are already taking place in Congress? So I mentioned at the top of the call, we fight for things like universal rental assistance and more housing supply, eviction prevention tools like emergency rental assistance. There's a lot of conversation. The administration has put out their own plan around housing supply. And there's a lot of focus around that. How does this add to the conversation? Or another way of putting it is, why is it not sufficient for us only to focus on housing supply?
Great question, Sarah. Thanks so much. If you listen to the experts that are being presented on TV that are talking about the national housing crisis in the papers, in the news, even from the White House, what you will hear is that all we need is to build, build, build. And once there's enough housing, it'll be the crisis will be over. But what we have to understand is that we need to build specific types of housing. People need accommodations for the size of their family, for access to education, for access to healthcare, to their family members, to their community. People need access to services and supports. People need to know that their affordability will be preserved. And that comes when tenants have power and when tenants are protected in their rights. We have this market, especially after the pandemic, where big multi-state and multinational corporations are buying up rental housing across the country. And as they do that, the tenants become smaller and smaller in their efforts to battle the big giant landlords. And so this set of principles and protections would create a collective action so that tenants are empowered as the supply is being built to say, this is where I'd like it to be built, and this is where I need to live, and this is what I want in my community, and these are the resources and the supports and the protections that we need to come with that supply. And so we really believe this is the second half of the conversation for the national, the rental crisis that's affecting Americans. And we felt like it wasn't being heard and that tenants' voices weren't being respected. It was a conversation about development, and we wanted to recenter that conversation.
Thank you so much for that, Noelle. And I'm like really impressed. I see folks on the line who have put their own summary of takeaways that we have from this meeting about how they can endorse the Tenant Bill of Rights, how they can share it with their partners, how they can share it with elected officials and candidates for office to get the word out and build the political will. So I want to thank Noelle for joining with us and giving us really clear directions on how we can take our next steps towards enacting the Tenant Bill of Rights. I also wanted to say that I've seen a lot of folks in the chat box, especially renters and people with lived experience, who are sharing examples of how the imbalance between landlords and renters have impacted them, commenting on what they see in the Tenant Bill of Rights. And I'd love to encourage folks, if you are a renter or a person with lived experience and you want to share your story of how you have won an important renter protection at the state and local level, or if you want to share about how that power imbalance has impacted your life, please reach out to the National Low Income Housing Coalition staff. And we'd love to have you be featured in maybe our blog or another forum for us to lift up your story and use it to call for the need for these sort of renter protections. So with that, I'm going to just use the last couple of minutes to say that I wanted to give an update on what's happening in Capitol Hill right now. The most important thing that we're seeing is work on the FY25 spending bill for HUD programs. And I wanted to raise for you what's going on there, what it means for us. So a few weeks ago, the House released their draft spending bill. And this week, we're expecting the full Appropriations Committee to vote on it and possibly other amendments on the spending bill. But we're really deeply concerned that it does not provide enough funding for HUD programs, and it doesn't provide enough funding to keep up with the need for housing that we have in our communities. So overall, the spending bill from the House proposes a 3% cut to HUD programs, or a $2.3 billion cut. And that might not sound like a lot, but at a time when we're seeing more people struggling to pay their rent, more people experiencing homelessness, that's a move in the wrong direction. And it doesn't provide our communities with the resources that we need to address pressing housing concerns. One of the reasons why we're seeing House Republicans put together this proposal is because it is in line with an agreement that was made last year between Congress and the White House to limit spending increases this year to just 1%. And while last year Congress was able to make a side deal that put almost $70 billion on the table, the House bill this year does not include that side deal amount, and therefore all domestic programs would be cut by about 6%, while defense programs are increased by 1%. So when it comes to the HUD's budget, what does that mean? There's a lot of reasons for concern. First and foremost, we're worried that the amount of money that they provide in the HUD budget wouldn't be enough to cover the full cost to renew all housing choice vouchers, which would mean that we could lose vouchers at a time when more people are struggling. I'm not so worried. I don't think that this is going to result in people having their voucher taken away from them. It's really about serving fewer households who are in desperate need for housing. We also see really dramatic cuts to some key programs that are used to provide housing, build housing for people with the lowest incomes. So both public housing operating and the capital fund receive really significant cuts of about $380 million, $318 million respectively. That means there's fewer resources to operate public housing, and it puts us further behind in addressing the capital backlog that's needed to address health and safety concerns with the properties themselves. The Choice Neighborhood Program, the Yes in My Backyard program, eviction defense resources, and Native Hawaiian housing programs are eliminated under the House proposal. And those are resources that are used to help address better zoning practices at the local level, to keep people stably in their house when they're facing eviction. We're also seeing the Home Investment Partnership Program is proposed to be cut by about 60%. So it's cut down to $500 million, a huge cut to the home program. And this is really critical unfortunate because home is the program that's used to provide down payment assistance to help homeowners. It's used to help bridge the gap so that affordable housing can be built. It's often used for tenant-based rental assistance as well. And really significant cuts are facing that program. Beyond the spending provisions that are in the House bill, there's also really harmful legislative language that would undermine fair housing, undermine renter protections, and undermine our work collectively to address climate change. So for example, the House bill includes language that would prevent HUD from enforcing fair housing laws, including the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. It would make it harder for communities to meet their legal obligations under the Fair Housing Act to actively undo racial segregation. The bill proposes to bar funding for any sanctuary community that's serving undocumented people. It would eliminate an important protection that I know the National Housing Law Project and many others fought for in the CARES Act that would provide a minimum of 30 days notice for households before they face eviction. And it would prohibit HUD from creating energy efficiency standards for new housing. We're going to keep a very close eye on this bill. Like I said, it's going to be marked up in the full committee later this week on July 10th. We're expecting that some amendments could be offered. If we hear about very harmful amendments, we're going to come back to you and ask you to call your members of Congress so we can stop those amendments from being added. On the other side, we are waiting patiently for the Senate to release their spending bill. We have a feeling that the whole process is going to take a pretty long time this year, like it does every year. We probably won't see a final spending bill until after the election. And we know that some conservatives are proposing to kick off any decisions on the spending bill until January of next year, so that an incoming Congress, which they hope will be an incoming Republican Congress, perhaps a Republican presidency, so that they can have more leverage in pushing for spending cuts. So it's really important that your members of Congress are hearing from you about how you can take action. I'm going to ask our colleagues if they can share a link to a national sign-on letter urging Congress to invest more resources into housing rather than to cut resources. This is a letter that's being circulated by the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding. And for you to also use our toolkit that has talking points and sample social media messages and other resources that can help you explain to your members of Congress how these spending cuts would impact you and your community, and why the federal government shouldn't be balancing the budget on the backs of low-income people. So with that, we're just a little bit over time. I want to thank everybody for joining with us, especially our colleagues at the National Housing Law Project. I'm so excited about this National Tenant Bill of Rights, and I'm really looking forward to working with all of you to build the political will that's needed to enact it and build tenant power. And with that, we're going to end today's call, and I hope to see you guys soon. Thanks, everybody.